Immigration is dominating the news at the moment, so what better way to explore this complex, emotive subject than with a blockbuster novel written from the heart of a marketing department. Seriously though, a book that sold millions, earned rave reviews, even got the coveted Oprah Book Club seal of approval. It must promise an intelligent, sensitive, nuanced take on the migrant experience. Right? Welcome to the Politics of Fiction. I'm Darren. I look at literature through a political lens, and today we're talking about American Dirt by Jeanine Cummins. So, let's do a quick review, as usual, before we get into the politics. So, this was quite a frustrating book to read. I had a few major problems with it. One is that I think it's quite a cynical and exploitative piece of work, and we'll get into that later when we talk about the politics. But just functionally, as a novel, as a story, I think it is also quite bad. It's overly long, it's melodramatic, it's saccharine, it's full of cliché, it's overwritten and far too pleased with itself, and it's also completely predictable. There's nothing surprising or interesting about it really. It actually starts out okay in the first third or so. It keeps you turning pages, the pacing is decent, there's some action, some intrigue, but it just gets duller and more overwritten as it goes on. So in the end, I found it quite tiresome and unenjoyable. Badly conceived and badly executed, and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. It's not worth your time. I saw one review from Chicano writer David Bowles who summed it up as harmful, appropriating, inaccurate, trauma porn melodrama. And I can't really disagree with that. So let's cover the plot briefly. American Dirt follows Lydia, who is a bookstore owner in Acapulco, Mexico. And at the beginning of the story, her entire family, except her and her son, are murdered by a cartel boss whom she is also inexplicably friends with. So Lydia and her son Luca flee to the north as undocumented migrants trying to get into the US. And most of the book deals with their perilous journey. They cross the desert, they ride freight trains, they encounter cartel violence, assaults, harsh conditions, along with trying to deal with their grief. They also gather some companions along the way, and they spend a lot of time witnessing the suffering of these people, which we'll get into later. In the end, they reach the US and live happily ever after, I guess. Presumably for a few months anyway, until they're deported or shot dead by ICE. So that's the story, and in terms of conception rather than execution, I guess it's fine. Like, there's probably a good version of this story that could be told, but this isn't it. Let's talk about the characters. I would say the main problem is that they are not realistic. They are either paper-thin stereotypes, or they belong to some archetype that only exists in hackneyed fiction, like children who act and talk like adults, for example. And nobody has ever belonged to this category more than Luca, the precocious fact rememberer. Now, the fact that Luca is a smart, thoughtful boy who's into trivia and who's a bit of a nerd, that's all fine. That's no problem. But in terms of how he speaks and acts, I just didn't buy him as a believable child at all. He seems manufactured. There's a real Gilmore Girls vibe to a lot of his dialogue, really over-scripted. It's affected and contrived. Also, considering what had just happened to him, I couldn't help thinking he should be more distraught, he should be more unresponsive, or in some way completely destroyed and consumed by trauma and grief. The antagonist of the novel, the cartel boss, is Javier Crespo Fuentes, also known as La Lechuza, the owl. The friendship between Lydia and Javier is one of the most ridiculous aspects of the story. We'll dig into that some more later. But just to say that, again, the problem here is that the character for me was just completely unrealistic. He's not presented in a credible way, either as a person or an antagonist. There are other characters in the book whose narrative role is hard to believe as well, like Lorenzo, the apparent ex-gang member, who has this supernatural ability to just keep showing up, to keep finding Lydia and Luca no matter where they go. There's a real kind of overpowered villain trope going on with him that I just found incredibly stupid. Some of the characters in the book exist purely as props for trauma to be inflicted on them. We have Beto, the wisecracking little urchin from the dump. We have the incredibly beautiful sisters Rebecca and Soledad from the provincial backwater in Honduras. The role of these three in the book is to serve as fodder, essentially, in order for the protagonist and the reader to witness their suffering. We'll get into that more in a bit. Then finally there's Lydia, the main character, who's just a bit of a nothing. She basically just worries for 500 pages. Her only trait, really, is that she's a mother. We don't get to see any other side of her, or even learn much about her personality or anything. Not much of a protagonist. One other thing to mention under characters is that we do get some flashbacks of Lydia's husband, the journalist, but very little. And even when we're privy to Lydia's thoughts, her internal grief and sorrow, she has almost nothing to say about him or their relationship, what she loved about him, any of the things they did as a family. I found this aspect a bit bizarre in its absence. I thought that Lydia and Luca should have been thinking and talking about him a lot more. Let's talk about the writing for a minute, and in terms of the writing, I think the first thing to mention is that the book is written in the present tense. I'm never a fan of this. Some authors can get away with it, but I still always end up thinking this would have been better just told in the past. I don't think it adds immediacy or urgency or anything. I just think it sounds clumsy and forced, and it makes for quite a cumbersome and stilted narrative. It's always there, you notice it constantly, and that's not a good thing. The perspective is a mess throughout. It flits between different characters and never really settles. This makes for quite a disorienting read at times. But more importantly, a novel with this sensitive subject matter really needs a strong central voice to relay these experiences, and that's just completely absent, robbing the book of any power or impetus or dynamism or any ability to evoke strong emotion. The prose, for the most part, is okay. It's functional, it's not terrible, but there are some sections that are incredibly overwritten, just really purple prose, way over the top. Here are two short examples of this melodramatic overwriting. Luca literally scratches his head. A gesture Lydia hasn't seen him make, she now realizes, since the decimation of their family. It's a gesture that in fact she never noticed before, and therefore she didn't miss when it vanished. But now that she sees it again, she's floored by an accompanying revelation that the gesture, one thumb on top of his ear, 3 fingers raking through his hair above, is specific to Luca's intellectual curiosity. It's a tic that happens only when he's intrigued by something, when he finds something interesting. The reappearance of it, therefore, feels to Lydia like evidence that her son might survive, that he might be capable, after 15 days and 1,400 miles, of temporarily losing himself in a moment of uncorrupted curiosity. The feeling that thuds through her sternum is hope. And here's another one. Lydia, he says it again, and it's so confusing, because her hatred of him is enormous. It's the biggest feeling she has ever felt. It's stronger even than the love she felt for Sebastian, the day they held hands and kissed in front of the altar at the Nuestra Señora de la Soledad Cathedral. Important detail. It's deeper than the colossal, unnameable thing she felt the day she pushed Luca out of her body and into the world. It's darker than the hole her papi left behind when he died without saying goodbye. Her hatred is a living succubus, vast enough and quick enough and wicked enough to crest up from her heart and take wing, to expand across the hundreds of miles between them, to engulf the whole city of Acapulco, to veil the room in which he's standing, to overshadow him and overcome him, to slip into his mouth and choke him from the inside out. She hates him so much she can murder him from 1,600 miles away, just by wishing for it. But he is saying her name, Lydia. Blech. And it's this kind of writing that really informs the tone of the novel, which is saccharine and maudlin for the most part, but then also strangely disturbing in some parts, due to some of the violence, which feels cheap and exploitative. Overall, the feeling I got from this novel was that it was quite a shallow, cynical, and manipulative exercise. So, let's get into some of the book's politics in more detail. Let's start by looking at the cultural perspective of the novel. This is a book that centers primarily on Mexico and Mexicans and on the migrant experience, including migrants from other countries in Latin America. And this culture is inevitably going to be quite foreign to a lot of readers of this novel. So what kind of world building do we get from the author? Is it credible? Is it accurate? Is it vibrant? Is it compelling? Is it entertaining? Is it informative? Does it teach us anything about this society, this culture, these people? I would say the answer to all these questions is no. While reading this book, I couldn't help thinking of the Mexican filter. The Mexican filter is a concept in Hollywood, which you'll find in certain types of movies, often mindless action movies, but also in the kind of Oscar baity, mediocre centrist dad political thriller, maybe a Tom Hanks or George Clooney vehicle, that kind of thing. When these movies depict Latin America, or the Middle East for that matter, you have this kind of yellow or sepia filter that's used, which is in sharp contrast to the bluish, much cooler tones used for the US. This more yellow tone evokes heat, aridity, poverty, desolation, danger. It's a visual trope that reinforces Western stereotypes of these regions as primitive or unstable, as third world backdrops for crime and violence, positioning US or Western European spaces as more orderly, cosmopolitan, sophisticated, superior. Edward Said, of course, wrote about this Orientalism in culture and pop culture, where anywhere outside the West is framed as exotic and backwards and threatening. It reduces the global South to a caricature, and it dehumanizes its people. It subtly embeds cultural biases and neo-colonial power dynamics all through cinematography. And the literary equivalent of that filter is very much present in this novel. There are countless examples of the white Western lens through which the author sees Mexico or Mexicans or migrants, exoticizing them and othering them, but also presenting them as these dull, lifeless stereotypes. This is not a book written for Latin Americans, obviously, because those books already exist. The author herself mentions them in her acknowledgements. She had to read them as research because they tell pretty much the same story. I would say this is not even a book written for people who are genuinely curious about Mexico or Latin America or migration. This is a book written for white people, mostly middle-aged, middle-class white people. It's a book written to elicit some tears and some oh dears and a kind of vague, insubstantial sympathy from suburban book club types, without actually dealing with anything material or authentic. The most immediate obvious way and the most egregious way that the book does this, how it displays its reductive cultural perspective, is through the snippets of Spanish that are used throughout. I could kind of see what the author was going for here, and I think she thought it would be immersive or give some flavor or whatever, but it's just facile and really annoying. So the characters in the book are mostly native Spanish speakers. They speak Spanish to one another. But obviously the book is written in English, so we just have to imagine, as we're reading in English, that they are speaking in Spanish. And that's fine. That's always been fine. In every single book set in a place with a language other than the language of the book. Not to mention in all translated versions of books. There was no problem to be solved here. There is no need to splice in these words here and there. And if there were a way to do this with some subtlety or some panache, Jeanine Cummins did not find it. So there are one or two times where she will say something in English and then repeat it in Spanish, like, "We are alive. Estamos vivos," which is redundant, obviously. But mostly what she does is just insert the Spanish word instead of the English one. For example, throughout the book, as they travel north, they refer to it as El Norte. Sometimes the Spanish is so close to the English that it's just unintentionally hilarious. A little boy is juggling a ballon de football on his knees. Tonight is difícil, so listen up. Esto es importante. Her face looks like a bomba about to go off. Come on. She is a tornado. She is an eruption. She is an huracán. Damn, I wonder what that could mean. I wish I spoke Spanish so I could understand. So this affectation is just patently ridiculous. It doesn't elucidate anything for the reader about Mexican culture or language or linguistics or anything. It's just a cheap trick that was terribly misconceived. A lot of the other issues with the novel's cultural perspective, I would say, are more to do with what's not on the page. This is a book of missed opportunities. The book has nothing to say about Mexican or Latin American culture or society. I know they're traveling north, but Lydia does reminisce quite a bit about their life in Mexico. There are a lot of flashbacks, and there could have been even more to flesh things out even better. But there's just nothing of substance to these snippets that we do get. We're told nothing of note about her city, Acapulco, except her mentioning all the violent crime and how it drives tourists away. Of course, the author, Jeanine Cummins, is a tourist. She's an external observer of the culture she's attempting to tell us about, so I guess that's fitting. The bookshop that she runs in the town doesn't seem Mexican at all. The way it's described is indistinguishable from a US bookshop run by some female lead of a rom-com from the 90s. There's nothing Mexican about her story at all. There's almost a complete absence of any major element of Mexican life. Religion, rituals, celebrations, food, sport, even literature. The cutesy bookshop scene where the mass murderer and gang lord picks out a few of Lydia's favourite books, and she's like, oh my god, we like the same books, how serendipitous. Even then, they're both Anglo authors. I mean, come on, make a little bit of effort. Google a Mexican author and put them in. Again, it's just a missed opportunity to dig into something authentically Mexican. There are a handful of passing references to Mexican things in the novel, but they feel like props, they feel like window dressing, so we can pretend that this isn't being written by a gringo who doesn't have a fucking clue about Latin America and has nothing authoritative or interesting to say about it. Even the effects of cartel violence on Mexico, which are ostensibly a big part of the story. I mean, she mentions it quite a bit, but she never digs into it. We don't get much culture from the characters either. As I mentioned already, most of the Latin American characters are simply walking tropes, or they're used as props. This is just another element of the cultural world building that feels really thin and underdeveloped. The different kind of migrants that they meet along the way, on the road, on the train, in the shelters, these people's lives, their stories, the places they came from, it's mostly either ignored or dealt with in a very superficial or exoticized way. Like the two sisters that they meet, Soledad and Rebecca, who come from this idyllic rural village in Honduras known as the Cloud Forest. Now, this place may well exist, but it just feels a bit tropey. It's like a Central American character written by J.K. Rowling. It actually reminded me of how Ireland is often depicted in non-Irish films and literature as some primitive agrarian civilization, when in reality only about 3/4 of the country is like that. There's an instructive passage that presumably inadvertently makes quite an interesting meta point about the novel and how disconnected the author is from the world that she's describing. This is when Lydia meets Beto. Lydia knows a little about Las Colonias of Tijuana because she's read the books about kids like Beto who lived there. That flair of recognition makes her feel like she knows him already, at least slightly, but that feeling is half hollow, a shadow puppet. Because though she may understand something of this boy's circumstances, she doesn't know him. I mean, the author could be describing herself here, and I agree. I guess we can't talk about the cultural perspective without mentioning appropriation, because this was the big controversy when this book was launched. Now, some of the controversy, to be fair to the author, seemed to have been whipped up more so by her marketing team. Apparently they chose this kind of border wall, barbed wire aesthetic for the display at her book launch, which is just a ridiculous detail. But anyway, on the author herself, she does have Puerto Rican heritage through her grandmother, but she is an American. She doesn't have a close relationship to Mexico, for example. Many people have already written about this migration trail, including Latin American writers. Like we said, Cummins mentions some of them in her acknowledgements. So I suppose this brings up the usual kind of questions like, did we need this book? Was this her story to tell? Would a Latin American writer writing something less commercially palatable have gotten the 7-figure deal, the Oprah Book Club stamp of approval, etc. I read an interesting detail that there was an author's note in the first version of this book that's since been taken out, in which Cummins stated that she wished someone slightly browner than her had written this novel. Well, Jeanine, someone did. You listed them in your acknowledgements. You read those books and then you wrote a shitty Hallmark version of them for undiscerning white people. Anyway, when I was reading about all this, I came across a great quote from the novelist Colson Whitehead, who said, "You can write about anything, just don't fuck it up." And I agree. By all means, write about whatever you want. But if you approach it cynically, if you appropriate other people's work or culture, if you exploit people's experiences without giving those people, those cultures, respect, credit, then you can expect criticism. The New York Times critic Parul Segal had a good line about this novel. A book can't exist on intention alone, especially when that intention is to give a face to the faceless brown mass at the border. Another aspect of this is research. Have enough respect for the serious subject you're tackling by doing the research. I'm not an expert on the Spanish language or Mexican culture or anything like that, so I'm not going to dig into this too deeply, but there are a few really good critiques out there that have been written about, for example, the very unidiomatic Spanish that she uses, the lack of cultural nuance, the oversights, the errors. There's one particularly great blog post written about this by the Chicana writer Miriam Gerber that I very much recommend. So anyway, there definitely seems to be a consensus among Mexican-American writers, among others, that linguistically and culturally and socially, this book is inauthentic, to say the least. Let's move on to the next point and talk about violence and political engagement. As exploitative as this novel is from a cultural perspective, I think it's even worse from an emotional point of view. The term trauma porn is overused, but I think it applies here. I think this book is written to evoke a kind of safe, superficial sympathy from its readers without actually engaging materially with the issues. The novel has a very kind of modern American liberal perspective of violence, in that the reader is called simply to witness suffering, not to actually engage with it or think about its origins, or try to solve the underlying material issues. And to a certain extent, apart from the bloody attack at the beginning of the book, which is fairly sensationalist in itself, this is largely true of the protagonist as well. Lydia and Luca spend most of the book seeing awful things happen to other people, often faceless, unnamed others. Let's look at an example of the exploitative violence that the author displays for the reader. So the two Honduran sisters we mentioned, Rebecca and Soledad, they're described as breathtakingly beautiful. Their physical beauty is remarked upon, I would say, dozens of times throughout the book. And having these two incredibly beautiful young women along on the journey with Lydia and Luca, it just feels like a cynical opportunity to wallow in the terrible things that will inevitably happen to them, and consequently to avoid it happening to the protagonist. It's the same with the poor little kid Beto, who meets a tragic end so that Luca doesn't. Or in another scene where Luca nearly falls off the train, but some lumbering anonymous farm worker does instead, and he loses his legs. These characters are props. They exist only to suffer, and to have Lydia, Luca, and the reader witness their suffering. Cummins builds a wall of collateral around her main characters. They never fully become victims, so that the violence and the inequity and the horror never impinge too much on the reader. Just enough for a superficial experience, keeping that trauma and terror at arm's length for the suburban book club types who are reading this, so they can feel a bit enlightened and a bit sad without being too affected. These middle-class, relatively privileged protagonists are our heroes. They are innocent, they are temporarily inconvenienced, they are distraught at what they witness, but ultimately they're safe from the harm that afflicts others. And that's clearly how the reader is supposed to feel too. And so the violence that we're subjected to, some of it relatively gory for a fluffy book like this, feels quite cheap and manipulative, which makes for an unpleasant reading experience. Another thing that didn't sit well with me in terms of emotional manipulation was the relationship between Lydia and Javier, the cartel boss. So firstly, I think having Javier as this kind of charming, cultured figure, whom Lydia would never suspect of being dangerous, wasn't that believable, but okay. Fine, I can buy it. But then the fact that there's such an affinity that develops between them, this burgeoning friendship, the chats that they have about literature and family, the undercurrent of romantic tension with this cold-blooded murderer, it's just too unrealistic again, and it feels like a fairly cheap way to heighten the emotional drama. I think it also leans into another trope that you see in romance sometimes. You see it a lot in modern romantasy and paranormal romance, where you have this very dangerous but desirable male, and it's a bit shady. I think a lot of it flirts with, if not descends into outright romanticization of violence and abuse. There's just such a weird dissonance between that cheesy Hallmark moment of him choosing two of her favorite books and then the fact that he murders 16 members of her family in cold blood. When they speak on the phone at the end of the novel in a terrible scene, it seems like Javier was looking for some kind of poetic symmetry by killing her child, since his daughter had committed suicide. And to me, at that point, it just seems so stupid that a woman like Lydia would ever have fallen for him. I don't know what exactly we're supposed to think of her character for having done that, and I'm not sure the author does either. The whole thing is just done for dramatic entanglement, in order to amp up the emotional manipulation of the reader. So what does the book have to say about Javier, about his violence and murder and the way he lives his life? Does it have anything to say about violence in general? The book does mention, for example, that a lot of young men get pulled into this gang violence world. But does it get into, for example, any of the socioeconomic or cultural reasons for that? No. Evil is just evil in this novel. It is ontologically distinct from cause and effect. Javier and his ilk are just bad men. There's no systemic analysis of anything, no curiosity, political, social, cultural, anything about this violence. It simply is. The author is only interested in the effects of the violence, which she presents rather clumsily and cynically in order to evoke a response. And this is one of my main problems with the book. It's completely divorced from politics, and there's a complete lack of political engagement. And if it was just a cutesy family story or whatever, fine, I wouldn't expect that. But this novel deals with some pretty weighty issues. Crime, gangs, violence, poverty, immigration, policing, institutional corruption, and so on. And it just studiously avoids digging into any of it. Once or twice, she will signal kind of a facile engagement with politics, but it's very superficial. Here's an example from the end when she's reached the US. There are many different languages in El Norte. There are codes Lydia hasn't yet learned to decipher. Subtle differences between words that mean almost but not quite the same thing. Migrant, immigrant, illegal alien. She learns that there are flags people use here, and those flags may be a warning or a welcome. So yeah, this is just vague, fluffy, political gesturing, nothing substantial. And even moments like this are rare in the novel. And certainly nowhere in the book does the author or the protagonist or any character dig into any of the social or political or cultural issues around crime or migration or anything that happens in the story. Nothing on poverty, nothing on governmental policy, not even much on identity politics or racism or anything like that. Certainly absolutely nothing on class. There's a bit on how women are treated horribly, but nothing institutional or systemic is explored around cops or border officials, for example. It's just the simplistic kind of evil men are evil and you find them everywhere. Not to mention that a lot of the violence against women in the book is cheap and exploitative, in my opinion. So I don't know if the author presents Lydia as completely politically naive, as an avoidance of having to reckon with political issues that she would rather not touch, or just because she, Cummins, is also lamentably politically naive and privileged enough to be disconnected from politics. I suspect a little from column A, a little from column B. In any case, using the suffering of migrants to sell your book without actually applying any political thought, material analysis, or human empathy to the situation is pretty disgraceful. So let's finish up by talking about the main political issue of the book, even if the author refuses to dig into it, and that is, of course, immigration. In this case, immigration into the US. So this is obviously in the news at the moment, with all of the deportations, assaults, kidnappings, and murders being carried out by the US government in the form of ICE. So I think it's interesting to ask, what does this book have to say about the US? And I would say overall, the US is described aspirationally. It's set up as a haven for the migrants, including Lydia and Luca. Now, there is obviously some material truth to that, which we'll get to in a second, but it's more the tone of this that really grated on me. This effusive depiction, the kind of awe and reverence that's employed. Here are two examples. The wait there with the other migrants feels like the longest stretch of hours in Soledad's life. Ever since Luca told her how close they are to El Norte, she fancies she can smell it there on the horizon. All the McNuggets and fresh Nikes. Here's another one, which is somehow even worse. The train slows way down and chugs right through the middle of the city. The streets are wider than Luca has seen elsewhere. The cars are bigger. There's a giant Coca-Cola can perched atop a building and countless radio towers stretching up into the sky. And then they all see it at the same time. A huge green highway sign with white writing and an arrow. There are only 3 letters on the sign. USA. They've reached civilization. How fucking patronizing can you get? So even before the current American administration got a lot more overt about their fascism in dealing with deportation, this would always have been a ridiculous way to depict the US. A country that has forever treated migrants like shit. A country that has deported and caged and assaulted and murdered millions of migrants under every president of both parties in the name of immigration policy. A country that has used up and spat out cheap migrant labor in order to build their gaudy edifice of capitalism and consumerism and commercialism. And this phenomenon happens to every violent empire throughout history. In the post-colonial phase, the imperial core is always flooded with migrants from the countries that empire has exploited and immiserated. This happens because of the economic disruption that was wreaked upon those countries and the demand for cheap labor. Historical actions like US-backed coups in Latin America, resource extraction, rotten trade deals like NAFTA, flooded Latin America with subsidized US goods, displaced millions of farmers and workers. At the same time, within the empire, you have labor shortages in low-wage sectors like agriculture and construction, so that pulls in the migrants willing to endure harsh conditions for low pay, perpetuating a cycle where exploitation abroad fuels the influx at home. We've seen the same thing with North African migration to France, French land expropriation, forced labor recruitment, imposition of language and culture. It destabilizes the countries, it displaces locals, and it creates labor pools for French industries. It's the same in Britain with the post-colonial inflows from India, Pakistan, the Caribbean, and so on. So there was an opportunity here for the author to show that it's necessary economically for Latin Americans to enter the US, while acknowledging why that is, at least mentioning the US's role in destabilizing Latin America, and in turn driving this migration, and not presenting the US as some shining beacon of prosperity. McNuggets and fresh Nikes, seriously. Fast food slop and Chinese manufactured shoes that are incidentally also both available in Latin America. Well, except for places like Cuba because of the US embargo. The only McDonald's in Cuba is of course in the Guantanamo Bay detention center, so that US soldiers can relax with a Big Mac and a shake in between bouts of torturing human beings detained without due process. Now that is America. Put that in your fucking book. Just one more thought on the main character. She comes from a fairly comfortable, privileged background. She isn't your typical migrant. So when she meets all these different people and hears their stories and witnesses their experiences, becomes companions with them, sees them suffer, do we get the sense that Lydia develops any kind of solidarity with these migrants? Or by the end, is she just glad to escape being a migrant? Again, it seems like the author doesn't really care. It's her indifference that permeates the novel and that suffuses the protagonist. She just wants those book club women to sigh and say, oh, it was so sad, and then put it back on the shelf and not think too deeply about any of the issues that were raised. This book is an exercise in facile liberal political posturing. It's the Nancy Pelosi kneeling in kente cloth of novels. In short, it's cynical, reactionary, and completely and utterly useless. Okay, that's it for American Dirt. Hope you enjoyed that rant. I'll be back again soon with another video. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. Good luck.